Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's book discussion and to welcome back to Georgetown and the Al-Walid Center, Professor Hadia Mubarak, the author of Rebellious Wives, Neglectful Husbands, Controversies in Modern Quranic Commentaries, which has just been published by Oxford University Press. Hadia Mubarak is Assistant Professor of Religion at Queen's University of Charlotte. She previously served as Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Guildford College and as a research fellow at New York University in Abu Dhabi. Professor Mubarak completed her PhD in Islamic Studies from Georgetown University, where she specialized in modern and classical Quranic exegesis, or tafsir, Islamic feminism, and gender reform in the modern Muslim world. She currently serves as a scholar in residence with the Muslim Community Center of Charlotte and as a scholar with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. The last decades have witnessed a proliferation of scholarship focused on women and gender in the Quran. Yet much of the scholarship evades a substantive engagement with Quranic exegesis as a scholarly genre. This lack of engagement with Quranic exegesis in the field of women in the Quran partially stems from evaluations of the exegetical tradition as being patriarchal and incapable of offering egalitarian interpretations. In Rebellious Wives, Neglectful Husbands, Controversies in Modern Quranic Commentaries, Hadia Mubarak explores significant shifts in modern Quranic commentaries on the subject of women against the backdrop of broader historical, intellectual, and political developments in 20th century North Africa. The floor is all yours, Hadia.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Esposito, for having me, and to the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. It's really an honor to speak at my alma mater, Georgetown University, and more specifically at the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, where I had the privilege of working as a senior researcher before I began my doctoral studies in 2007. I am especially grateful to Dr. John Esposito, who's a friend and a mentor for over 15 years now, for his unwavering academic support and mentorship. It would not be an exaggeration to say that he is one of a few scholars in this country who pioneered the field of Islamic studies and whose critical scholarship paved the way for many of us to research, write, and teach about Islam unapologetically. I'm honored to share with you today research stemming from my forthcoming book with Oxford University Press, Rebellious Wives, Neglectful Husbands, Controversies in Modern Quranic Commentaries. I will now share my screen with you and share my PowerPoint. And if there are any problems seeing this PowerPoint, do let me know. So put this in share mode. Nowhere has a question of divine intent been as pressing for Muslims in the past 2 decades in the field of women and gender in the Quran. In the 21st century, Muslim women are caught amidst a polarity of interpretations regarding their position and rights within a religious tradition that spans 1,500 years. The status of Muslim women in the world today is by no means monolithic. In some Muslim majority countries, women have been elected as heads of state and have a higher ratio of education to men. For example, Mali, Indonesia, Pakistan, Senegal, and Turkey, among others, have all elected Muslim women as heads of state in the recent past. In other Muslim majority states, however, women still struggle with an unequal standard of citizenship characterized by restrictions on travel, divorce, and custody rights. To what extent are current practices or their justifications embedded in religious texts? Is the Quran, Islam's primary scripture, empowering and egalitarian to women, or is it inherently patriarchal and even misogynistic? So as Dr. Esposito mentioned in his introduction, the past 2 decades have witnessed a proliferation of scholarship that engages this question of women in the Quran. Yet much of this scholarship has not really engaged with tafsir studies, with Quranic exegesis as a genre on its own. And as mentioned, much of this lack of engagement stems from evaluations of this exegetical tradition as patriarchal and incapable of offering egalitarian interpretations of the Quran. I argue that this evaluation requires a critical reassessment. Rather than discard the exegetical tradition as meaningless to Muslims' contemporary efforts to recover the Quran's gender ethics, I attempt to resuscitate this tradition. More specifically, I bring into conversation the distinct fields of tafsir studies and women's studies by situating the genre of the Quranic commentary in the center of a scholarly analysis of women and gender in the Quran. And in doing so, my book affirms the need for a critical engagement with tafsir studies among scholars concerned with women in Islam. This engagement, however, is less meaningful when only driven by efforts to critique and deconstruct the Muslim exegetical tradition as patriarchal, voiceless of women's perspectives, or flawed by the presuppositions that exegetes impose on its gender verses, even when this is sometimes true. Rather, our scholarly excursions into tafsir studies from a gendered lens should also seek to understand the genre's intellectual history, development, aims, methods, and construction of interpretive authority. The serious engagement with tafsir opens up its gateways and provides a clearer understanding of its inner mechanics. By removing our visors of critique, we become more attuned to the blind spots in our vision, recognizing the potential for critical engagement within the exegetical tradition. Rather than pit a seemingly egalitarian Quran against an allegedly patriarchal exegetical tradition, I seek to understand the tafsir's tradition's views on women in the context of its own genre and in light of its historical development. My book examines the intersection of modernity and Sunni exegetical thought on women. More specifically, I situate three influential Sunni Quranic commentaries, tafsir, in their historical context of 20th century North Africa. And I pay close attention to the intellectual encounters and discourses that impact their approach to gender in the Quran. The first commentary I explore is Tafsir al-Manar, co-authored by Muhammad Abdo and Rashid Rida. It is regarded as a first modernist approach to Quranic interpretation. The second commentary I explore is Sayyid Qutb's Fi Dhilal al-Quran. It was partially written during his imprisonment in Egypt and described by Johannes Jansen as one of the most widely translated and distributed Islamic books of all time. The third commentary I explore is At-Tahrir wa Tanwir by the Tunisian Mufti Muhammad Al-Tahir ibn Ashur. This commentary is one of the most methodologically rigorous commentaries of the 20th century. And I argued that the historical context of colonialism and modernization in late 19th and early 20th century North Africa set into motion new ways of engaging with gender in the Quran. I illustrate this in two ways. First, I carefully sketch significant shifts in these modern commentaries on verses dealing with neglectful husbands, that's 4128, rebellious wives, polygyny, and marital hierarchy. And I do this by comparing these modern interpretations with those of 7 medieval commentaries spanning from the 9th to 14th centuries, and illustrating the strains of change and continuity in modern Quranic exegesis on gender. Second, I explore the broader contemporaneous debates on women in Islam in 20th century Tunisia and Egypt in specific, and illustrate the ways in which modern exegetes engage these debates through the medium of their commentary. In comparing pre-modern and modern exegetical interpretations of gendered verses, I am interested in exploring 3 broad questions in the field of Quranic studies. The central question this book examines is, how does modernity and its accompanying discourses on women impact Quranic commentators' approaches to verses on women in the Quran? When we compare medieval and modern interpretations of verses concerning women, do we find a repository of interpretation that is consistently and monolithically patriarchal, as one scholar described the pre-modern genre? Or does a heightened gender consciousness of the modern period produce more egalitarian interpretations of the Quran? The second question I explore in this book is, what historical developments precipitate the preoccupation with women's rights among Muslim scholars and intellectuals in the 20th century? How do exegetes' historical context, intellectual orientations, and positionalities influence their engagement with a seemingly static and unchanging pool of sources by which to interpret the Quran? Third, and most importantly, I ask, how is interpretive authority constructed in this tafsir tradition? How do exegetes, or how have exegetes throughout the centuries succeeded in positing new interpretations? or rejecting previous ones while simultaneously anchoring their authority in this tradition? The answer to this question intervenes in current debates on the construction of interpretive authority in Islam. I will now move on to introduce the authors of the four authors of these three modern commentaries, as one of the commentaries is co-authored, and look at their distinct intellectual orientations. So Muhammad Abduh represents a form of Islamic modernist thought that emerges in response to the perceived political, moral, and intellectual crisis that faced the Muslim world in the late 19th century. While Rashid Rida is regarded as Abduh's most important disciple, who is actually responsible for the dissemination and publication of their Quranic commentary, Rida's orientation is a bit distinct from that of Abduh. During the end of his career, he shifts towards Reform Salafism with an acute interest in geopolitics. Sayyid Qutb reflects a strand of Islamist intellectual thought that emerged in the context of post-revolutionary Nasser Egypt. Although he begins his career as a literary critic, he is most known as the intellectual voice of political Islam and specifically the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. He is the author of Fi Dhilal al-Quran, the most widely disseminated work of any modern tafsir. And the fourth exegete, Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur, reflects a form of Islamic thought that has not received as much attention as the former three: Islamic modernism, Reform Salafism, and Islamism. As a neo-traditionalist, he was one of Tunisia's most renowned scholars, holding the positions of Sheikh of Zaytuna University, Maliki Sheikh al-Islam, and the State Grand Mufti. He produced At-Tahrir wa Tanwir, again, one of the most methodologically rigorous works of modern tafsir in 1973. And I find his approach very interesting, as we'll see as we move on, that he very much embeds his methodology in the classical tradition, yet continues to articulate a path for change and opine at times for new opinions. And these exegetes' diverse intellectual encounters or orientations, influence their engagement with the Islamic scholarly tradition, which in turn shapes their approach to Quranic interpretation. While I pay attention to their intellectual orientation, I avoid the pitfalls of using labels by highlighting the individual over the ideological. Furthermore, I revisit their personal biographies in light of broader and structural developments in Egypt and Tunisia during the first half of the 20th century. Due to the rapidly changing context of the time period, I argue that each intellectual encountered a different mode of Arab modernity. Whereas Abduh and Rida encountered a modernity specifically associated with the West, Ibn Ashur and Qutb encountered new realities of centralized Arab nation states and the forging of new national identities. Rather than attempt today to cover the substance of 9 chapters in 30 minutes, I will confine my presentation to the key takeaways of this book. The first takeaway of my book is that Quranic commentaries often function as a dialectic. Rather than perceive Quranic commentaries as only engaging with the Quranic text itself, a more accurate understanding of the genre is that authors are often engaging with the ideas of other scholars. They're speaking to contemporaneous issues, and they are reflecting the intellectual priorities of their time period. The project of Quranic interpretation does not take place in a vacuum. And this becomes most pronounced when we compare modern and pre-modern exegesis through the lens of gender. I will now move on to describe the historical context which frames these 3 exegetical works. The modern period ushered in a new theoretical concern with the subject of women, not only in Quranic commentaries, but in society at large. As Layla Ahmed describes in Women and Gender in the Quran, for the first time in Muslim history, women emerge as a central subject for national debate. Much of this debate was precipitated by the colonial encounter, which articulated a framework of progress for Arab women premised on the abandonment of native culture and religion. The obsession of colonial administrators with, quote unquote, saving brown women from brown men, a phrase coined by Gayatri Spivak, served to impart the sense of a civilizing mission to their imperialist project. Even after colonialism came to an end, the post-colonial state internalized the presumed backwardness of its indigenous culture to justify the embrace of the economic and political projects of modernity, as Mervat Hatem explains. Due to the discursive domination and the internalization of the colonial critique of Islam's treatment of women, the subject of women in Islam became representative of a greater ideological battle of the merits of Islam as a religion and its capacity to respond to the evolving needs of modernity. Despite their divergent aims, the colonial narrative on women in Islam was perpetuated by Christian missionaries, Western feminists, indigenous Arab intellectuals. Well-meaning feminists in colonial North Africa, such as Eugene Lebrun and Hubertine Auclair, entrenched the idea that Arab feminists should look to their Western counterparts as moral beacons in their efforts for reform. While two different strands of Arab feminism emerged in the 20th century, in Egypt in specific, the dominant one valorized the West and associated itself with the secular tendencies of society. This historical context set into motion new ways of engaging with gender in the Quran. All four exegetes use the occasion of their tafsir to respond to colonial, Western feminist, or indigenous secular critiques of Islam's treatment of women. A heightened gender consciousness permeates modern Quranic commentaries, as all four commentators articulate that it was Islam, not the West, that first established and protected women's rights. So notions of gender equality and women's rights emerge as significant themes in Quranic exegesis for the first time. The language of women's rights in Quranic commentaries is particular to the modern period and gains tremendous currency in public discourses by the end of the century. In contrast, medieval exegetes reflect no attempt to salvage Islam or its primary text from charges of patriarchy, gender inequality, or gender injustice, although clearly notions of justice was at the center of their discourse. As Quranic commentaries often reflect a dialectical relationship between the exegete and his or her society, I will illustrate the ways in which these three commentaries engage with established discourses on women in Islam. I argue that Muhammad Abduh's vision and program for reform functions more as an internal response to the intellectual and political decadence of his time than simply a response to Westernization. The focus on Abduh's reform movement as primarily a response to Westernization, in my opinion, reflects a Eurocentric bias in much of the early Western scholarship on Abduh. This bias betrays the notion that all genuine impulses of reform in the world derive their inspiration from the West. Muhammad Abduh, more than any other exegete in his time, was determined to offset the charges against Islam's treatment of women and use the occasion of his tafsir to affirm Islam's commitment to women's equality and freedom. He is one of the first Muslim intellectuals to argue that women's oppression stems from other Muslims, not Islam. He assigns 90% of the blame for the difficulties Muslim women faced to Muslims themselves and 10% to the rigidity of jurists. In some of Abduh's writings, he responds directly to the British consul, Lord Cromer, whom he accuses of failing to distinguish between Islam, a global religious tradition, and the behavior of Muslims, which is ironically an argument that continues to be relevant over a century later. Although colonialists blame Islam for the dismal state of Muslims, Abduh argues that Muslim intellectuals do not blame Christianity for the dismal state of European women in its previous few centuries. While the colonial critique of Islam unquestionably looms on Abduh's radar, he is far more interested in internal religious reform, as he primarily addresses fellow religious scholars. For example, in his critique of polygyny in verse 4, in his exegesis of verse 4.3, the polygyny verse, Abduh doesn't reference Western criticism of this institution, unlike Rida, although he was certainly aware of British administrators' disdain for polygyny. Rather, Abduh appeals to fellow religious scholars, primarily Hanafi jurists, to repeal the laws on polygyny in Egypt. He does so not by arguing that this institution is ancient or out of sync with modernity, but rather invokes the Islamic legal maxim of preventing harm and also securing the public welfare, the maslahah of society. And really, he is the only commentator among both pre-modern and modern exegetes I examine who takes a strong stance against the modern application of polygyny, and there are many reasons for this. This was partially informed, I believe, by his own experience as someone who grew up in a polygamous household, as well as his experience in the judiciary. The need to respond to the colonial critique of Islam's treatment of women is most pronounced in Rashid Rida's writing. A close analysis of his interpretation of polygyny in 4.3 and marital discipline in 434 reflects his preoccupation with refuting Western criticism of Islam. His defensive posture, nonetheless, appears to overturn some of Abdo's interpretations, especially in regards to polygyny. The starkly different interpretations by Rida and Abdo of the polygyny verse, among others, points to the need to recognize the diversity of views among scholars who presumably share a similar intellectual orientation. I illustrate throughout the book the ways in which Rida exhibits more conservative views on women than his mentor, who is Abdo. This is evident in Rida's commentaries on verse 4.3, 434, and 4.128, which betray essentialist views about women as emotional, quick to judgment, and desiring frivolous chat with their husbands when men are trying to solve the world's problems. And most evident in Rida's exegesis is an apologia that is absent in Abdo's discourse on women. Whereas Abdo had no qualms critiquing Muslims for what he considered to be their abuses and injustices against women, Rida, on the other hand, appears to justify and defend certain practices by pointing to Europeans' moral deficiencies. So, for example, he affixes an 8-page fatwa to the end of Abdo's commentary on 4.3, and he makes this argument. He says, let them, the French, inform us, have men been satisfied with this limitation to one woman? Does there exist in every 100,000 men in Europe one man who does not have a sexual affair? Yet, despite this seemingly essentialist notion about women, Rida uses the opportunity of his exegesis to champion their rights. So Abdo and Rida's discourses ultimately signal a significant shift from pre-modern ones on women in specific. In fact, Rida devotes, very close to the end of his life, an entire book on the subject of women in Islam, which he titles The Rights of Women in Islam and Their Fortune in the Universal Muhammadan Reform. And this book is a perfect example of Rida's aim to reverse the colonial gaze, insisting that Europeans' treatment of women remains inferior to that of Islam, despite their exaggerated claims to have liberated women. By the time that Sayyid Qutb was writing his tafsir, nearly 6 decades after Rida and Abdo first produced their commentary, the social and cultural climate of Egypt had considerably changed. The earlier rhetoric of colonial powers, which conceived of Muslim women's liberation through the abandonment of native customs and traditions, had become entrenched in the secular echelons of Egyptian society. The greatest proponents of Western cultural imperialism during the mid-20th century, as William Shepard points out, were Muslims themselves. Qutb's commentary best represents a resistance narrative to indigenous, secular, liberal, and feminist discourses on women. He appears to directly engage with Arab feminists in his commentary and expresses astonishment that Muslim women would want to imitate Western women. He argues that Islam would be comprehensively implemented, women would not need a feminist movement to begin with. And throughout his commentary, he makes the argument that Islam's treatment of women is the highest ideal that any civilization had reached. The most significant shift in his exegesis is a new framing, or his new framing of gender issues in idioms and notions that are particular to his own context. Much of his discourse on women, among a host of other issues, operates from his diagnosis of Egyptian society as jahili, ignorant. Like Abdo before him, Qutb also distinguishes between Islam and the normative practices of Muslims. His critique of Muslim abuses against women stems from his broader critique of Egyptian society as steeped in deep jahiliyyah, which infringes upon the rights of God, men, and women. His most distinct interpretation of those I explored was his view on men's degree as restricted to the context of divorce. Whereas most medieval exegetes interpreted this latter part of the verse, men have a degree over them, as broad and extending beyond the context of divorce they described in the beginning of this verse, Qutb, on the other hand, believed that it was very much restricted to this context. While women are waiting in their waiting period, as this verse is clearly establishing a waiting period, as it mentions at the very beginning, divorced women must wait for 3 monthly periods before remarrying. So in this context, he says that husbands basically have the upper hand where they can either revoke the divorce, as mentioned, within this 3-cycle period, or wait for this waiting period to expire, thus finalizing the divorce. And he says men's degree is nothing more or less than this, upper hand they have during the waiting period, which seems to overturn many medieval interpretations that this was evidence of men's legal, social, or ontological superiority over women. Of course, there's much more to be said about this verse, but in the interest of time, I will move on. In line with his view of tafsir as a scholarly endeavor, Ibn Ashur's discourse on women is most concerned with engaging the exegetical tradition itself. It is absent of the anxiety or polemics that permeated Rida and Qutb's refutation of colonial, Western, and indigenous secular critiques. As Bashir Nafat notes, At-Tahrir wa Tanwir stands out as one of the least ideologically constructed works of tafsir in the 20th century. Although his commentary engages with contemporaneous issues, he is less interested in responding to existing critiques than in providing a corrective to the tradition itself. And in doing so, he attempts to save it from falling into an abyss of irrelevance. So, for example, in his interpretation of verse 228, he argues that classical Muslim jurists have not always upheld the gender parity, mumathala, prescribed in this verse, pointing to a controversy in Maliki law, and he was obviously a Maliki jurist and the Maliki Shaykh al-Islam at one point in his life. He writes, the opinion of the jurist who believes a father can marry off a virgin daughter without her consent has denied her the right to parity with a son. And the opinion of the jurist who prohibits her forced marriage and says she can be married off without her consent has affirmed her right to parity, mumathala, with the male. And again, this is a mumathala that's coming directly from this verse when it says that to women are rights like those against them. In the context of intellectual ruptures and in modern Muslim thought, his tafsir reflects the vindication of classical, philological, and legal approaches to exegesis. Yet his loyalty to this classic hermeneutic does not confine him to the meanings derived by his pre-modern predecessors. By giving precedence to legal, logical, and philological reasoning, he posits an unprecedented interpretation of 434 that bridles male authority over women. And similarly, his commentary on 4128 overturns classical interpretations of this verse by shifting the consequences of a man's nushuz, his neglect or disinclination, to the husband himself. So if I had more time, I would talk a little bit about this verse, but it's very interesting because this is a verse that describes men's nushuz, which is oftentimes seen as their neglect, right? The title of this book. The same word is used in 434, women's nushuz, but their medieval exegetes said this was the rebellion of wives. And Ibn Ashur is not so sure that this word should be interpreted differently. And he says, actually, the nushuz of men is the same as the nushuz of women, which is the hatred of the other spouse. And there's a lot more to say here. So this leads me to the second takeaway of the book. Unlike the assumptions made by some scholars of the Quran, interpretive authority in the exegetical tradition is not premised on reaching the same conclusions as medieval exegesis. Quite the contrary, my study demonstrates that each of these modern Quranic commentaries challenge the dominant interpretive position on at least one of the verses I examine. Yet they all find a varying degree of acceptance within the global Muslim community. And this acceptance, I argue, is primarily a function of how interpretive authority is constructed in the Muslim tradition. It is achieved by grounding one's work in recognizable forms or methods within the tradition, not necessarily by repeating the same interpretations. So while their modern interpretations do not radically subvert exegetical assumptions about men and women, they certainly push back against some patriarchal interpretations that have dominated the genre of exegesis, thus creating new sites of engagement for Muslims who refuse to concede tradition and egalitarianism as mutually exclusive pursuits. The third main finding of my book is that medieval and modern tafsir tradition is pluralistic, complex, and reflects evolving interpretations of women and gender in the Quran. This diversity undermines existing depictions of medieval interpretations as monolithically patriarchal, although patriarchy informed many of their interpretations on women. It would be a mistake, however, for us to jump to the conclusion that that the pre-modern tradition is all patriarchal and that the modern tradition is necessarily egalitarian. In fact, we can find egalitarian interpretations within the medieval tradition and the modern one, as well as patriarchal interpretations across the historical spectrum. The notion that pre-modern exegetes were not concerned with women's rights, justice, or potential abuse against women is unsubstantiated by my research. While medieval exegetes posit some interpretations that entrench male privilege, they were also clearly concerned with curbing potential abuse or injustice towards women. For example, medieval exegetes viewed verse 4.3, the polygyny verse, as primarily concerned with men's responsibility to ensure justice towards women and any female orphans under their guardianship. Some argued that monogamy was preferable for women since it was the best guarantee of justice, based on the literal meaning of the Quranic phrase, that will be more suitable to prevent you from committing injustice, referring to marrying one wife. In a similar vein, as early as the 8th century, there were outliers to the dominant interpretation of verse 434, which allowed a husband to lightly hit his rebellious or sexually deviant wife as a last resort. The 8th century Mufti of Mecca, Ata ibn Abi Rabah, argued that a husband should never hit his wife, based on Prophet Muhammad's example. This prophetic precedent led him to interpret 434 as discouraging the hitting of rebellious wives rather than allowing it. Ibn Abi Rabah was not the only pre-modern jurist to adopt this position. As I illustrate in chapter 5 of my book, the legal opinions of Ibn Abi Rabah and Ash-Shafi'i become critical points of intervention in bridling male authority in 3 Quranic commentaries on verse 434. The medieval commentaries of Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi and al-Razi both take this position, as well as the 20th century exegesis of Ibn Ashur. My research intervenes in the question, what is the origin of patriarchy or androcentrism in the genre of exegesis? Some scholars, such as Kisha Ali, Aisha Hidayatullah, and Ibrahim Musa, believe that androcentrism is to some extent inherent to the Quranic text. Others, such as Aisha Chowdhury, believe that androcentric readings of the Quran stem from medieval exegetes' patriarchal cosmology. Scholars such as Esma Barlas and Amina Wadud have argued that androcentrism or patriarchy is a function of the way male exegetes have read or failed to read the Quran. So on one hand, I find that pre-modern and modern exegetes' views on women were often embedded in their historical and socio-cultural realities. For medieval exegetes, their conceptions of women's roles, capabilities, and weaknesses were in fact informed, in some ways at least, by existing social hierarchies, which they projected upon the text. However, what I mainly find is that certain patriarchal interpretations gained currency in this genre, not because of its linear atomistic methodology, as some scholars have argued, but partly due to the genealogical nature of the discipline of tafsir. So exegetes established their authority in this tradition by engaging with previous exegetes and by demonstrating a deep familiarity with its discursive history. So there's a lot that one can say here, but what happens is that as exegetes display mastery by engaging with previous authorities, they inadvertently perpetuate certain patriarchal arguments in the genre. It is important to point out, however, that this genealogical tradition does not mean exegetes were simply parroting previous opinions, nor did it mean that they were endorsing an opinion if they cited it. And I will give you a concrete example. So verse 228 in chapter 2 of the Quran begins with this expression, divorced women shall wait concerning themselves, bi-anfusihinna. The 12th century exegete Ibn Umar al-Zamakhshari deliberates on the reason that God adds this phrase, bi-anfusihinna, concerning themselves. And he concludes that women's spirits, anfus, are desirous of men, so they have been commanded to suppress themselves, anfusihinna, overcome their desires and force themselves to wait. This particular reading by al-Zamakhshari was not the function of a particular method, but reflective of his own presumptions about women. As a German philosopher, Hans Georg Gadamer states, the possibility of influence by shared presuppositions increases in the absence of authoritative tradition. So although al-Zamakhshari's indictment of women's nature as desirous of men was not based on any authoritative source within the genre of tafsir, his exact interpretation was repeated nearly verbatim by two of the most influential commentaries of the medieval period, Al-Razi's Mafatih al-Ghayb and Al-Baydawi's Anwar al-Tanzil wa Asrar al-Ta'wil. So the question is, did Al-Razi and Al-Baydawi agree with this indictment of women as so eager for men that it's difficult for them to wait 3 cycles before remarrying? It's difficult to know with certainty, but the repetition of Al-Zamakhshari's statement on women's spirit as desirous of men should be understood within the intellectual context of this genre, as both were attempting to refute Al-Zamakhshari's Mu'tazili views while also building upon his significant linguistic findings. So exegetes' choice of citation is not merely a reflection of personal preference or methodology, but also a reflection of their engagement with the intellectual history of the genre and the academic priorities of their milieu. Rather than make sweeping and often unsubstantiated generalizations about a genre that spans several centuries, I find it more constructive to identify the ways in which patriarchal readings emerge and become entrenched in this genre. And I believe this is an area where further research is needed and encouraged. In conclusion, the Muslim commentators of the Quran viewed the project of Quranic interpretation as a springboard into an endless ocean of meaning. The vastness and depth of the exegetical tradition was a byproduct of the perceived timelessness of the Quran itself. It was particularly their belief in the Quran's divine ontology that opened rather than restricted the possibilities of interpretation, since no exegete could claim finality to his or her interpretation. When they embarked upon the arduous journey of writing a multi-volume commentary of the Quran, they recognized that the existing corpus of Quranic commentaries had not captured everything there is to know about the Quran. This is partially because knowledge was not viewed as the only prerequisite for understanding God's intent, but rather having spiritual experience. Either Al-Ghazali describes it as dhawq, spiritual tasting, or basira, spiritual insight, was also seen as a prerequisite. And this, the requisite and validity of spiritual experience created a timeless horizon against which the Quran's readers were invited to seek its signs and discover its deeper meanings. So the capacity to bring new meanings to bear on the Quran is not only intellectually viable, but inherent to the exegetical tradition. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Hadia. And I think it's time for us to open this up to questions from our viewers.
All right, excellent. So if anyone out there does have a question, please put it into the Q&A. We do have some time for Q&A. So our first question is from Sarah Omar. Sarah says, thank you so much, Hadia, for this talk. Could you speak to how your findings compare to Aisha Chowdhury's? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Omar. So this is actually a really important question. So as you know, Dr. Aisha Chowdhury primarily focuses only on 434. I look at a series of verses, and my main question is what changes in the modern period? And I confine my research to the scholarly genre of tafsir. So I'm not looking, Aisha Chowdhury's book, if you're familiar with it, basically looks at modern commentaries, not through the genre of tafsir itself, but through articles, opinions circulating, around the internet, and other. I think she also uses audio cassettes, etc. I'm really focusing and honing in on the genre of tafsir itself, the genre of the Quranic commentary, and what changes in the modern period. One of the main changes is that there is this attempt and need to respond to the colonial critique, to indigenous secular critiques, and then later with Ibn Ashur to respond to the tradition itself. And Ibn Ashur does this with 434 in an interesting way. In fact, I find that his modern commentary is the most distinct, although he grounds his methodology in very classical methods, and he basically notes that perhaps the addressee of this verse, when it says "Wadribuhunna," hit them, is actually not addressing husbands, but it's addressing the legal authorities of the state. In fact, I have an article in the Journal of Quranic Studies that focuses on Ibn Ashur's commentary of this verse. And I basically point to the malleable boundaries of tafsir. So I think this is one of the main distinctions I find, as well as I think the other key difference between my findings and those of Aisha Chowdhury is kind of looking at the way there are some outliers in the pre-modern period that are in many ways also saying no to a straightforward or literal interpretation of the verse. And so I argue that although we've seen sort of the emergence of this, I would say that today this is seen as one of the most controversial verses in the Quran, 434. There, I've counted over 50 publications that have been printed on this verse alone. And yeah, I also would like to, in this book, kind of unearth some of the tensions that I believe existed in the pre-modern tradition as well, as not sitting comfortably with this idea that husbands could just hit their wives, right? And attempting to impose restrictions.
All right, we have a couple of questions here coming in. So again, please feel free to submit your Q&A. This first question is more of a comment from Vasir Bakashbak. They say most discourse on gender issues among Muslims is based on Eurocentrism. They say they believe we need to use a universal of Quranic understanding to articulate gender issues, more so that nation states are not working for Muslims, and we need to go beyond this notion of nation state to discuss gender issues. Would you like to comment on how the notion of a nation state or traditional Eurocentrism has created issues for understanding gender identity within a modern context?
I mean, one thing I talk about in my introduction is kind of this double consciousness, state of double consciousness, a phrase turned by W.E.B. Du Bois, when it comes to Muslims engaging in this question, right? And to recognize that we are caught in the 21st century in this space where there's this long backdrop, this long history of gendered Orientalism, of representations of Muslim women as, the abused victim, if you will. And as someone who is writing about women in the Quran, I try to be very sort of self-aware and conscious of the audiences to whom I'm writing, as to the questions that I privilege and why I privilege them, and to really just admit the reality of what this double consciousness means for Muslims in the West, right? That we sort of, in many ways, our very existence blurs the contours of East and West. And so, yes, I think when we talk about women and gender in Islam, at least on my end, I think it's important to do so universally and to, kind of move away from this binary of Islam and the West, and kind of look at this in a way that gives homage to the Muslim exegetical tradition and giving homage to, Western, very important and valuable Western scholarship.
You have a bunch of additional questions. So this question is from Zainab bint Yunus. They say, Salam, I'm looking forward to your book. Do you have any examples of how conservative traditional Muslims today use medieval tafsir while also integrating more modern perspectives without accepting modern progressive takes?
Okay, so I think labels can become very problematic sometimes because we have to agree on what do we mean by these terms. That's the first and foremost thing I'd say. So, it depends on what we mean by traditional, what do we mean by progressive. But one thing I push back against in this book is this idea that, that we cannot find egalitarian or quote unquote progressive positions on women in the medieval tradition in some of this, on some of these verses, despite the overall patriarchal bent, right? And so I'm not absolving the medieval exegetical tradition of, yes, imposing and in sometimes entrenching patriarchal interpretations. It's clearly there. On the other hand, there are opinions that have been sort of lost in the ashes of exegetical history that we can dig up and find as very incredibly useful sites of engagement for Muslims who are today engaged with recovering the Quran's, ethical impulses, if you will. So I don't know if that really answers the question. And I think I talk about this in chapter 1 of the book, the importance of just being aware of how we use labels and what labels mean, and just really defining what we mean when we use them.
Our next question is from someone who wishes to be anonymous. They ask, could you please explore the range of interpretations of the verse on striking a bit more? How do exegeses get to the interpretation that the verse discourages physical hitting?
Yeah, and Dr. Chowdhury's book, which I'm glad Sarah Omar brought up, is also an interesting source to look at, because she does a very comprehensive survey of the pre-modern exegetical tradition in specific. So, one can also look there. However, what I try to point out is looking at the outliers outliers to this dominant position. And Ata ibn Abi Rabah, who was seen as the Mufti of Mecca, is one of the first places to look, as well as the Prophet himself, right? So if the Prophet himself never hit anyone, even when he had problems with his wives, if he himself was not implementing this verse, then clearly it created space for exegetes to say that this was not a verse that was prescribing hitting, but rather restricting it. And so the Mufti Ibn Abi Rabah was one of the first to make this argument. And this specific argument appears in the commentary of the Andalusian commentator Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, who was a Maliki scholar. And he basically says that a man could never discipline his wife or child without losing some of his own religion, his own spirituality. Like there is a price to this. So, and if you are familiar with Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, clearly one of the giants in Maliki law. And so, there were early on, what I point out, there were tensions with understanding this verse as prescribing hitting as a last measure. Rather, some argued that this was actually restricting a pre-existing practice. We find this also in the tafsir of Ar-Razi, who uses the legal opinion of Ash-Shafi'i, and Ar-Razi was a Shafi'i scholar, who also says that based on the prophetic precedent and the legal opinion of Ash-Shafi'i, this is not prescribing, right? This is not obliging this last resort. And it's similar to the way one can understand the polygyny verse, I think. If we try to put these verses within their historical realities, what was going on in 7th century Arabia, I think Esma Barlas does a really good job actually in her book with pointing out the way the Quran is engaging with that socio-historical reality. And I think we need to we need to situate the Quran back in that historical reality in order to understand why exegetes were viewing this as a restriction rather than a license. So I hope, and then Ibn Ashur, of course, is one of the very interesting places to look on this verse 434. Of course, it's in the book, it's chapter 5 of the book, and there's also a journal article in the Journal of Quranic Studies where I go into this in more detail.
We have a couple more questions here, and also for those that wish to go to the book page, we have a couple of links in the chat, one to Amazon and one to the publisher's website. So the next question is from Nuran Al-Madan. She says, thank you so much. Unfortunately, I've noticed a trend among many that refuse to recognize the pluralism and diversity of Islamic tafsir and jurisprudence as liberal or, quote, Western. How can we argue for interpretations of Islam on women's issues, which have historically existed, and ensure that women receive spiritual and communal justice?
sorry, I had trouble unmuting myself there. So I'm not exactly sure. Is it possible to put that back up there? The question, I think it, I can't see it anymore. Is it under answered?
Yes, it will be the last under answered on the bottom.
Okay. So in terms of, again, describing I clearly agree that the exegetical tradition is pluralistic and diverse. That is one of the primary arguments of the book. I don't quite understand, whether, or I don't know if we would necessarily, describe it as liberal or Western, because again, there's a lot of baggage, I think, that comes with how these terms are used and what we really mean. I mean, in fact, in Islamic studies, I think when we use the words Western, it's only useful when we're talking about geography. But the reality is, for those of us who study the history of the Arab world, is that the contours of East and West begin to blend, begin to disappear, right? Because what we find is that there's been a historical discursive exchange between what we consider to be East and West. And so when we say, Western tradition, Eastern tradition, I'm not necessarily saying, we need to move away from these categories, but rather that they're not so rigid and not as hermetically sealed as we think they are, right? The fact that, Islamic theologians were to some extent informed by Greek philosophy, to know that European philosophy were informed by the rhetoric of Muslim theologians, right, and philosophers. And so there's been this really important exchange, intellectual exchange historically, that defies these categories as being very rigid and binary. So how can we argue for interpretations of Islam which have historically existed? And I think I understand your question to talk about women in Muslim communities. And I'm glad you raised this question, because the reality is, and one of many audiences that I hope this book speaks to, are Muslim communities themselves. I hope the scholarship also is relevant to pressing needs within these communities for women who maybe are at the, unfortunately facing abuse or facing, spiritual abuse, where religion is weaponized and used to justify certain practices or abuses. I argue when I teach on Islamic feminism, how important it is for Muslim women themselves to be engaged and literate in their own religious tradition, in their text, not just the text of the Quran and the Hadith, but the broader, classical tradition as well, whether we're looking at law or tafsir or theology. And really, I mean, the only way to push back against what I would call religious patriarchy is by using that religious discourse to unravel and untangle this patriarchy from divine intent, right? Because divine intent for Muslims is ultimately what they are seeking. What does God want? What does God mean when he says in this verse, whatever it might say, right? And so that is why I think it is useful to try to, again, engage with this tradition and look and uncover those precedents for egalitarianism, not just for theoretical reasons, but for those Muslim women in those communities that can give them authority to push back, right? It can give them authority to push back against misreadings and patriarchal readings. So I hope that's helpful.
We have a couple other questions coming in, so we're going to hope to try and address them as much as we can. We have another question from Zanab bint Yunus. Also, any commentary do you have from you on conservative female scholarship? They mention Anas Tamara Gray, Dr. Haifa Yunus, Dr. Aisha Vazvaz, and others, and how they present and discuss tafsir.
So the one I'm most familiar with is Tamara Gray, Dr. Tamara Gray. I find her very interesting. I am most familiar with her engagement with the history of Islam, specifically the early history of Islam, and rereading that history or reteaching that history from a gendered lens, which I found to be very useful. I'm not familiar with any tafsir that she's presented, as well as I'm not, I apologize, I'm not very conversant with the opinions of the two scholars that you mentioned.
Okay, we have another question here. This is also from an anonymous attendee. Again, if you want to submit anonymous questions, you can do so. You just have to select the checkbox. As a revert, I appreciate the liberating aspects of Islam on many fronts, especially keeping names, property, and ownership, and acknowledgement of their humanity and spiritual equity, which took the Christian world many decades to realize. Do you think that reverts have influenced the views of Muslims when it comes to modern ideas of women's education and sports, sort of bringing a piece of Western culture, Islamic values, though they realize you're focused on tafsir, they're interested in your opinion on this?
I think this is a important question. I think it's inevitable for human beings to express their religion through the medium of culture, right? That their understanding of religion is mediated through their own cultural realities. And I think to believe that we can escape our positionalities is sort of naive, right? And so, yes, we all bring to our reading of the Quran, our reading of the tradition, if you will, our own positionality, our own worldview, our cultural sensibilities. And I think that's the area where we really can push back against, and there have been scholars who have been working on this, Kishali in Islamic law. Another author who writes in Arabic, Dr. Ruqayya Al-Alwani in Bahrain, the professor there in Bahrain, talks about the role of urf, of custom and culture, in sort of perpetuating certain patriarchal ideas, specifically in family law. And so the fact that culture becomes sort of the backdrop against which people understand and mediate religious texts, I think is a given. And if we accept that, then I would say that, yes, I think for Muslims in the United States who have reverted from other faiths, or not reverted, let's say converted from other faiths, I do think they have a lot of value to bring to how we can understand the scripture, how we can understand religious texts, and that really no one has a monopoly, if you will, over, and one of the things I found most profound when doing this research is that although exegetes are engaging with previous authorities like Al-Tabari, Al-Zamakhshari, Al-Razi, and very much paying homage to their work, they had no qualms with disagreeing with them and saying, Al-Tabari was straight up wrong when he said that women should be tied to their beds, right? And one exegete after another will say he was wrong, yet they're still engaging with his work. They still take some of his other opinions. And what that shows us is that this is an open discursive tradition where there is still room to, correct misinterpretations and posit new interpretations that have not been posited.
We have a couple more questions. This question is from Anik Misra. They say, thank you for your great presentation. If tafsir reflects the genealogy and mores of the scholars who wrote them, and their job is to expound on Quranic meaning for others, how do you think that affects the idea of the text being able to continue to inform or guide devout readers, challenges their false ideas when it comes to gender after initial messages and challenges to non-Muslim Arabs? Is there a way to try to read modernity into the text or mitigate established opinion? How does the Quran inform society if society informs tafsir?
Okay, yeah, and I'm not sure I completely understood the longer question there. So when I say understanding tafsir as a genealogical tradition, what I mean is not to dismiss the tafsir, but rather to understand its inner mechanics, right? And I believe you're probably very, very familiar and conversant with tafsir. And so the reason I think this is important is in understanding the question of where does patriarchy emerge in exegesis, right? So for some Muslim women, it's important to untangle the patriarchal readings from the Quran itself. And so one way to do so is to try to understand, where do these patriarchal interpretations come from? How do they emerge? How do they get recycled and perpetuated? And one way my research finds this happens is by understanding the inner mechanics of tafsir itself, that it's building upon one another. So the example I brought forth of Al-Razi and Al-Baydawi all saying that women are being told to wait because they just can't wait to get with another man, right? They're so eager. Their spirits are so eager. They covet men. Did they really believe this themselves? I don't know. But what I do know is that they are citing Az-Zamakhshari's opinion, not necessarily because they agree with him, but because this is the way they are establishing their authority. This is the way that they are basically building on his linguistic insights while refuting his Mu'tazili theology. And if we try to situate these commentaries within their own intellectual milieu, we can begin to have a clearer understanding of why and where some of these interpretations come from. And then, yes, to push back against some of these interpretations while also perhaps taking some of them. One of the opinions I did not mention, which I believe was lost in the ashes of exegetical history, if you will, was one of the earliest ones of what this men's degree meant, right? And it came from the Prophet's own cousin, Ibn Abbas, Abdullah ibn Abbas, who said, you know, this is men being given not a degree of authority, but a degree of responsibility to waive some of their wives' responsibilities while still fulfilling all of their responsibilities to them. So meaning that if your wife is not fulfilling her responsibility, your degree means you pardon her from that, yet you fulfill your responsibilities to her. And At-Tabari takes this opinion. The 10th century Baghdadi exegete says this is a correct opinion after he cites 5 possible opinions, right? And yet this is not an opinion we really see later on. In fact, we see ones that are trying to explain why men were given a degree. And this is, as Karen Bauer talks about actually in her work, this idea of trying to explain the why of a verse actually inadvertently also ends up perpetuating certain patriarchal ideas, because now the exegete is speaking from his own presumptions. Well, why does God give men a degree? Well, because men are stronger, men have a greater intellect, men are writers and authors and, you know, are the ones doing the heavy labor. Again, there's nothing inherent to the text that says that, right? This is a presumption that's being imposed on the text, if you will. So I don't know if this fully answers your question, but I hope it does at least some justice to answering your question.
We have a couple more questions. This one from an anonymous attendee. Do you have any resources or suggestions on where to look for the exegetical history on interpretations relating to the verses in the Quran on veiling? They are interested in knowing when and how scholars came to consensus on what they considered to be proper and or correct veiling.
I mean, I think the best place to look personally, I mean, if you read Arabic, I think to go to the classical texts themselves, you know, beginning with At-Tabari and moving on, you know, to some of the 11th, 12th century exegetes and sort of doing a chronological analysis and it really helps you engage this question of the development, as you say, you know, the development of interpretations of the verse on veiling. I think it's important for us to look at tafsir chronologically in a historical, you know, putting them in their historical context. In terms of contemporary works, I believe Fadwa al-Gawindi has a good work on veiling. I don't know to what extent she's engaging with tafsir. I don't believe she's engaging with tafsir, rather looking at normative practices, as well as Layla Ahmed's book on veiling, which again is also not concerned with tafsir itself, but concerned more so with the significance and relevance of the comeback, if you will, the comeback of the hijab in late 20th century Egypt, as well as North America. So, and of course, there's a lot that can be said about that, right? Because the discourses I talk about at the turn of the 20th century impact Muslims themselves and the way Muslims perceive their own tradition, the way Muslims perceive markers of their tradition, especially visible markers like the hijab. And I think until today, we are sort of caught in that, if you will, post-colonial politicization of the hijab. It wasn't something that was politicized by Muslims themselves, but it has become politicized today.
We have one more question here from Wazir Bakeshbach, And the question is, we have to identify the universals to evaluate interpretations by experts. Each expert will be influenced by his or her realities. Would you like to comment on how experts are influenced by the realities they may exist within, and how this could relate to, I guess, their question may be directed towards scholarship or interpretation?
Thank you, Wazir, for your question. I mean, I think this is very important. This is, Fazlur Rahman was one of the earlier scholars in the United States and North America specifically, who was writing on the importance of sort of reading the Quran through its universal principles. And there have been many others after which Dr. Taha Jabir al-Alwani, for example, was one of those people. Amina Wadud, in her first book, Quran and Women, talks about the importance of the universal principles as well. And of course, this is something that is very much front and center in modern Muslim thought. However, and coming from, I guess, the position of Western academia myself, I also point out that we cannot escape our historical context, even when we try to transpose ourselves into the, even as I as a scholar trying to transpose myself into the historical milieus of the different authors I'm engaging, and trying to understand what were the issues, what were the priorities, what was informing this opinion. I cannot fully escape my own reality and what this means for me as a Muslim American woman in the 21st century. And I think it's very important for us to, own up to that and to understand how our current realities, social, cultural, political realities, inform our readings of the text as well as our reading of the tradition itself. So, I hope this partially answers your question. And I really appreciate all of your questions. And I hope we can continue to engage in further conversation on a lot of these very relevant issues in the future. And if you read the book and you have any feedback for me, I'm actually very, very open and would encourage and welcome feedback. So I will ask Mr. Andrew to add my email address to the chat, because I'm very, very open to feedback on any questions or even constructive criticism and advice you have for me.
Well, thank you very much, Hadia, for a very engaging talk, and our followers for the discussion. I strongly encourage people to buy your book. It is thoroughly readable and engaging, and I think a major work in an area in which there have been quite a few publications lately, but I think this book definitely breaks new ground. Let me also alert you to the fact that next Wednesday at 2 p.m. we will have a program on securitization in U.S. foreign policy. And the following day, on Thursday at 12 p.m., we'll have a program on Islamophobia in France, 2022 elections, which are coming up in France, and the criminalization of Muslim civil society. France, as some may know, has become an extraordinarily Islamophobic society, ironically under Mr. Macron, who would be seen as a progressive or a liberal vis-a-vis some of the far right in France. But indeed, his administration has passed some very controversial legislation. So thank you all, and look forward to seeing many of you next week.